Hey everybody, it's Scott Shetler here at Extreme Performance Training Systems in Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome to this week's episode of Strength and Health TV. In this week's episode, I want to take a look at one of the kettlebell lifts that I've seen that tends to give most of the people that are learning to do it the greatest problems, and that's the kettlebell jerk. Out of all the kettlebell lifts, this one has probably the biggest issues with timing when people are first starting to learn the lift. And honestly, most people that do the lift are usually going to be competing in kettlebell sport, or they're wanting to eventually compete in kettlebell sport, so they learn the technique of the jerk so that they can start training it, as that is one of the lifts that is done in competition, either in the biathlon where you're doing the short cycle jerk, or in the long cycle where you're doing the clean and the jerk. Like I said, most of the issues that people have with this lift that I've seen tend to be timing related, and I spent some time teaching some kettlebell certifications for the World Kettlebell Club back in 2009, 2010, somewhere around there, and this was one of the lifts that we taught. And probably out of all the lifts that we taught, we taught all the basic kettlebell lifts: the press, the push press, the jerk, the long cycle, the snatch, the swing were kind of the ones that we mainly focused on. And out of all those lifts, it was the jerk that tended to give people the most problem. So I got to give a lot of credit to my friend Steven Khuong over at the Ice Chamber. He's the one in charge of the Ice Chamber gym and the Ice Chamber kettlebell sport team. And I was talking to him one day, I think we're at a contest, maybe the Arnold or maybe down in Florida or something. And I was telling him that I, usually have issues teaching the jerk. It's usually with the timing, and I tried all these different ways to get people to get the timing when you're transitioning from the first dip to the second dip and then the lockout in the jerk. And he taught me a really simplistic way to teach it. And once I implemented his strategy, I found I was able to get people to do perfect timing in the jerks, usually in under 5 minutes. And sometimes we'd spend, half hour, with some people. Most people usually caught on a little bit more quickly than that, but what I found was people would often do the lift, and I'll demonstrate it here when I'm demonstrating technique, but they would often do the lift like they're doing a press and then just kind of jumping their feet, but there was no synchronization in the movement there, so it was just really weird. So once Steven gave me these few pointers, I was able to get people to perfect their timing in the jerk the first time they try it, and it's really made the learning curve much shorter as I've been teaching this lift to the people that I train. I'm currently not doing a whole lot with kettlebell sport right now, but I do have a couple lifters that I am coaching and helping them with their programming and progressions, and they're actually doing quite well. And when I've done these kettlebell certifications in the past for people who want to be kettlebell trainers, or just if it's a kettlebell training workshop where people are looking to further their skill, I have found these strategies with the kettlebell jerk to be very, very successful in helping people clean up timing issues. So the way that we break it down is we look at really 3 positions in the jerk, and I teach those positions independent of the actual lift itself. So we have position 1, where we're holding the kettlebell or the kettlebells if we're doing two-handed lifts in the rack, and we're dipping down, where we're bending the knees and dropping the hips into the first dip. Position 2 is what we call the overhead squat, or really it's an overhead partial squat, where you're catching the kettlebells in the locked out position overhead, but your knees are partially bent, your hips are partially bent, so you're in kind of a partial overhead squat position. So that's where the elbows lock out and the knees are still bent. And then position 3, you're actually standing up to full extension to complete the lift before you drop the bells back to the rack. So when I teach this lift, I just get people into the first position. I have them hold that position for a few seconds, and we just drill that position over and over and over. So they get used to how the hips are positioned, how the knees are positioned, how the body's positioned, and then how the kettlebell sits in the rack on the body. And then I just tell them to go to position 2. So we just press the kettlebell overhead, we drop down into that partial overhead squat position, and we drill that a few times. And then we go to position 3, which is just simply standing up from that bent knee overhead squat to a full extension where the kettlebell's locked out overhead. Then we drop the kettlebell back to the rack, and then we practice those position 1, 2, and 3 drills again. So after we do that for about 5 minutes, I put the students in the position 1 with the knees dipped, the kettlebell's at the chest, the hips are forward, and we got that first knee dip in the jerk. And then I just tell them to jump to position 2. So we've programmed 1, we've programmed position 2, and I just tell them to jump to position 2. And when they jump and they land in position 2, it immediately clears up timing issues because they're not thinking about it. They already know the basic mechanics. Then all you have to do is add this jump into the movements. Now, it's not often the cleanest looking jerk, but the timing is perfect. And I found that if you can get the timing down perfectly, then you can clean it up and polish it up a lot easier after, as opposed to trying to build a perfect jerk technique from the get-go. So they just jump to position 2. Inevitably, they always land in that overhead squat position. The timing is perfect. The heel stomps right as the elbow locks the weight out overhead. And then you just simply from there stand up to position 3 and you've completed the jerk. Drop the kettlebell back to the rack and then repeat. So then we drill that stand in position 1, jump to position 2, stand up to position 3 pattern over and over. And then, like I said, in about another 5 minutes, they've got the movement down to the point where we can actually start practicing the jerk, tying it together, and then begin cleaning up some issues, maybe taking out the jump and just making it more the explosive heel drive, because your feet really don't need to leave the ground. Usually it's just the heels that leave the ground when you're doing a correct jerk. But again, it's much easier to clean up once you get those timing issues in place. So again, props to Steven Khuong for teaching me these tips. It's made it much easier to teach the jerk. It's made it much easier to demonstrate the jerk. And now the jerk is not something that a lot of the people I work with fear. It's something they pick up on very, very quickly. And if you look at what some of the kettlebell instruction organizations out there, they talk about the jerk like it's this impossible lift to do. And it really isn't. And I think that if you're having issues, if you're a beginner kettlebell lifter, which is who this video is targeting, if you're having issues with the timing and the jerk and it's become really frustrating, I think these techniques or these tips will really help you clean it up. So go ahead and give them a shot. Take a little bit of time to practice, and I'd be willing to bet that within about 15 to 20 minutes of practice or less, you should be able to dial in and clean up your jerk technique. So if you're an advanced lifter, this probably won't apply to you, but if you do have issues with your timing, or if your students have issues with the timing, I bet if you implement these tips, you'll see the jerk become a lot cleaner, just as I have with my students and with the kettlebell, or with the personal trainers who come to me for kettlebell trainer workshops or kettlebell trainer certifications. So let's go ahead and take a look at this technique, and you can see what I'm talking about here. So again, usually what I see when I'm teaching the kettlebell jerk, or what I saw early on, was people would end up pressing out the weight, while simultaneously, after that elbow breaks the body, they would do this little hop and make it look like they're trying to do a jerk, but then the arm's moving very slow, and it's not. It's actually a press with some weird foot jump movement, so it's not actually a jerk. The idea with the kettlebell jerk is you're trying to use your legs to drive the kettlebell into the air, and then you're just landing and locking out your elbow underneath the bell, so you're landing in the catch position in a partial overhead squat. But the key is that big leg drive to drive the elbow off the hip or off the body to get the kettlebell moving upward, and then you're just falling under the kettlebell, locking out in that overhead squat position. And that's usually where the timing issues start for most people, because you want to land, when your heels stomp on that jump, your elbow should lock out at the same time. Okay, so that's the timing issue that we usually saw with people, was they were pressing it out and then they were just kind of dropping their hands, or they were, not really jumping, they were just kind of stomping their heels or like dropping just to let the hips drop as they were pressing the weight out, and it wasn't actually a jerk. So like I said, these tips have really cleaned up the movement. So usually where we start, I have the student clean the kettlebell to the chest in the rack position. I tell them to get into the position 1, which is to keeping the heels on the ground, bend the knees, let the hips go forward so that the elbow is still in contact with the hip and the kettlebell's in the rack position. So that is the position 1. Position 2 is the partial overhead squat, where the heels are down, the hips are now back, the knees are partially bent in a quarter squat position, and the kettlebell's locked out overhead. That's position 2. And then position 3 is just to simply stand up so that you're at full extension. All right, so those are the 3 positions that we drill. So we'll show you how that looks with the kettlebell. So we're going to clean the kettlebell up to the rack position. Elbows on the hip or on the body near the hip. The knees are going to bend, the hips are going to go forward so that we keep the connection between the elbow and the hip. One of the biggest mistakes you see people make is they shoot the hips back like a regular squat, and then the elbow has to break away from the body in order to hold the kettlebell in the rack position, and that's not correct. We want the elbow in contact with the body. So we're going to dip the knees, the hips go forward, the heels are still on the ground, and that is position 1. Now position 2, just have your students press the kettlebell overhead, drop down into that partial squat. Now the hips are going backward in a more correct squatting pattern. The knees are bent in a quarter squat, the elbow's locked out overhead, the kettlebell's locked out overhead, the arm's straight. That's position 2. Position 3, you just simply extend the knees, straighten the knees so that your body's at full extension, and then you can drop the kettlebell back to the rack to begin the next drill. So when you tie it all together, again, you're going to have your students drill position 1 by itself, just get used to the body mechanics so they get comfortable in position 1. Then you're going to have them drill position 2 by itself, so they get comfortable in that locked out position with the kettlebell overhead, the partial squat. And then you're just going to have them stand up to position 3. And once you do that for about 5 minutes, all you have to do is get them in position 1 and then say, now jump to position 2. And that's the real trick of this. And when Steven explained it to me, it just sounded too simple. I really didn't think that people would catch on quickly. But like I said, ever since I've started using this technique, everybody that I work with gets it the first time, first or second time. There's almost no learning curve. It just makes a lot of sense. So you're going to have your student get into position 1. Now once they're there, you just say jump to position 2. So they're literally going to jump. The feet are going to leave the ground. Again, that is not the correct way to jerk, but we're just focused on the timing of the lift here. So you're going to say jump to 2 and then stand up to 3. And right there you've got perfect timing in the transition from the first knee dip to the second knee dip and the overhead catch and the jerk. So you can even have them practice it without the kettlebell at first, just so they could get a feeling of what it's like to jump and literally have them jump. So again, you're going to get them to position 1, say jump to 2, and you'll see as the heel stomps, the elbow's locked out, perfect timing, stand up to position 3. So again, this can be cleaned up later, but once you get the timing down, it's going to be a lot easier to clean it up. So have your students clean the bell up to the chest, dropping into position 1, jump to 2, stand up to 3. And what you should have seen there is that when my heel stomped on the ground, my elbow locked out and the timing was perfect. And I'm getting a big leg drive because of the jump. So I'm really exploding the hips into that elbow to send the kettlebell up into the air. And that's really the key, because the jerk begins with a massive leg drive. It's not a press. All right? So again, you get them in position 1, jump to position 2, stand up to position 3, the timing's perfect, and then you can go on and clean it up and tighten everything up to the point where they're not really jumping anymore to get to position 2, but they're doing more of a correct jerk technique where you're using just enough force to launch the kettlebell into the air and then dropping under for the catch. It actually becomes more like an explosive calf raise. The heels leave the ground, the toes are still on the ground, and you're just using enough force to send the bell off the chest, get that vertical movement going so that you can drop under and catch the bell with the second knee dip. So cleaned up, it's going to look a little bit tighter. It's not going to be as aggressive of a jump. You're getting down into position 1, exploding to position 2, and then standing up to position 3. Dropping the kettlebell back into the rack, position 1, 2, and 3. So it really is as simple as that. Like I said, I got to give my buddy Steve some serious props on that one, because that little tip, I never thought about reducing it to something that simple, but that little tip has really shortened the learning curve for everybody that I've been working with for the past few years since Steve taught me that tip. They catch it usually the first or second time they try it, but really the success lies in drilling those positions over and over. Like I said, spend about 5-10 minutes. Stand in position 1, stand in position 2, step up to position 3. When you do that over and over and get that repetition, then you just lay it on them. Okay, now get in position 1, now jump to 2. You're going to see instantaneous that timing is going to be perfect. And then you drill that for a while, and then you can start cleaning it up and perfecting the jerk technique. But you do that, you'll get your students doing a correct jerk a lot faster. It's going to shorten the learning curve. It's going to save them a lot of stress. It's going to save you a lot of stress, because I had about 6 or 7 different ways to teach the jerk depending on the personality type of the student or the trainer that I was working with, and this really cleaned it up. I mean, I've actually been able to do this with some of my online coaching clients. I give them these tips, and pretty soon I get a video coming back from them on YouTube where they're doing it perfectly. So it really makes learning the mechanics of the jerk a lot easier. So again, if you're this video is a little bit more for the beginner or the novice lifter who's just getting into kettlebell lifting, or maybe starting to train for kettlebell sport. It's not really for the advanced person. If you're advanced, you've been training for a while, you probably already know how to jerk. But if you don't know this technique and you are a teacher and you do have issues getting your students to learn how to, or your students or your clients to learn how to do the jerk properly, I guarantee this will help you get the movement, the technique across a lot faster, because you're going to nail that timing right away the first time that they do it, and then it's going to be so much easier to clean up after that. So hopefully, if you are an advanced lifter or a teacher, you found some value in this video as well. As always, if you got any questions or suggestions for future show episodes, please leave those in the comment section below this video. And as always, stay strong and stay healthy.